Welcome back. This is a tutorial that was requested from a couple different people back in August. It is now September, which is based off of a bag that I did back in July that was a something that I have had an idea for since the previous November of 2023, and I just never had time to kind of implement it and sit down and see how I would execute it. And so in July, that's exactly what I did. I had been buying the material since like a week after the Tortured Poets department came out, but I didn't have a chance until July, and so here we are. I made a bag, and it was essentially faux friendship bracelets shown on the front of the bag. I'll put a picture here. I got a lot of questions about how I did it, although it's pretty straightforward. It's not difficult at all. And it's nice because I sew it in a way that keeps it so that the beads aren't going to come off. Now, for this is going to be a hanging for a friend of mine's workshop studio, and it's going to say in my Sew Whatever Studio era, and I'm okay using plastic or acrylic beads on this because I know that it's going to be hanging. But for the one that I did on my bag, I didn't use anything that would potentially melt or get crushed or shatter and crack or anything like that, because it is a handbag. It's going to get bumped around. And the last thing I wanted was for a bead to be melted when I was pressing the bag, or somebody to carry it their first time and they put it down and it falls over, and then two of their beads are cracked and broken. So I only used metal beads for that bag for a very specific reason, because it's meant to be used, and I didn't want anything bad to happen to it. But I also needed to figure out a way to sew it, like I said, so that nothing is loose and so that this stays put when I put it on. So I want it not only to be durable on the beads themselves, but also on the sewing. And so thankfully, just playing around, I came up with this solution. I am sure that there is a name for this. I'm sure that if I did remotely any bead embroidery Googling, I would have had this to reference, or I would have had that to reference, but I didn't. I literally just had the beads, grabbed some vinyl, and sat down and figured out how I wanted to do it. And this is what I landed on. It's a little bit more difficult if you're doing more intricate things like overlapping. So this is my second time doing this ever, right? And the first time, none of them overlapped. They all just kind of went below one another. And this one, it overlapped, and it required a lot more planning than I actually did, because I did part of this at an event at my friend's studio. That was on the fly, and like the pattern isn't really perfect, right? On this one and this one, it starts with a colored bead and then ends right here in a double metal bead, which is not ideal for me and my perfectionist brain, but it is what it is. So if you wanted to plan this out a little bit more effectively than I did, I do suggest that you do something like this, where you would put them on the string and then put them on the bag however they're going to be, or on that panel, and then kind of figure out just how many you'll need by just kind of draping it on that spot. That's what I did for my bag, or for the bag, it's not mine anymore, the bag that I made. And I just kind of, this time I just made a little, I actually took one of my friendship bracelets, laid one down that was like the median size of all of them, traced the oval shape of it when it was laying down, and that's where this came from. So anyway, I just used that to trace these on there. I'm using a friction pen for that. The thing about these friction pens, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, don't use them, they will never come off of your material. And absolutely, when you use heat to remove them, you're not removing the heat, you're masking the ink. Or I'm sorry, you're not removing the ink, you're kind of masking it. And so since it is temperature reactive, it can come back over time. But if you just wipe it off, because it's not being absorbed into this material, it won't show back up again because you have then removed the ink. So that's why I will use friction pens on the surface of my vinyls and stuff like that, as long as it doesn't absorb it. I'm not going to use it in an area where it's going to be seen in something like fabric where it will absorb the ink, and then the only way to remove it is then heat, but then we know it is temperature reactive, so it will come back at some point in time. So I don't do that. So anyway, if you're going to use a heat erasable pen, that's totally fine. Just make sure you wipe it off when you're done. We're losing light, so hopefully you can see this. These are the needles that I use. I use these for essentially anything I'm doing in bag making that will require hand sewing. It's just, I believe this is Tex 80 thread, and you can even see how nice and large that hole is right there. It's a good size, it's thick and it's strong. It's not too long and pointed of a tip there, but it really just gets the job done. So these are my favorite, and I always have them on hand. I think I got these from Wawak. They're called darners. Let me see. Yes. Hopefully that helps you. Then I also recommend a pair of snips nearby and a thimble if you have sensitive fingertips. And I'm also using a needle minder for this process just because I was at the retreat and I snagged a bobbin from our workshop with this thread in it. So now it's even more special. And so I needed something to hold that and my needle when I was ready to take a minor break. And so that's just a handy thing you can have, but you don't need that. It's just a bonus. So I recommend drawing your line just so that you know exactly where you're going to be inserting your needle, and you can really angle your bead the way you need it to, and it just kind of takes the guesswork out of it for you. The hardest part is going to be starting, is figuring out where to insert your needle for the first stitch, but then after that, the way that we're sewing it, you'll always know where you need to go as long as you have this line drawn on your front. So I'm going to figure out where I want my first star to go. Don't worry, those will be right side up. And if it's hanging, I think I do want it like right there. Alright, so I'm going to take these off. So I am going to take a guess that this star bead is probably going to give me a little bit of an issue because they are, it's kind of on the side of one and through the tip of another, but we'll see. I'm going to zoom in here and hope that the lighting works with me versus against me. But I am going to start my first stitch from the bottom. I'm not going to knot it or anything. I'm going to leave it long. And I'm going to just try and get myself in the general area of where I wanted it to be, and poke my needle through on that black line that I drew, just like that. And so I'm going to make it nice and tight, and actually because it's crossing over the direction that I'm going to be beading, I'm going to move my needle minder and bobbin up here out of the way. So now I have my thread coming through on that spot right there, and I'm going to thread the needle through my bead. Now one thing to keep in mind is if your needle is too big and you have beads that are too small, you're going to have a real hard time trying to thread everything. So make sure that you just kind of have the best case scenario for everything that you're choosing. And so it's a little tough on this first one, but what I'm doing is I'm going to keep this bead nice and taut up against that needle, that first needle hole, and I'm going to angle the exit hole, all these words, I don't like them, to be right on that line, and then I'm going to put my needle right next to it. Admittedly, the star might not have been the easiest one to show you with first, but the friendship bracelet, the letters are way easier. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle back in that hole, that first needle hole, and that way I will know that I'm still staying on that line, I'm going to go through that bead again. And I didn't knot this or anything. This is just loose thread here. And then I'm just going to pull it nice and taut. And so you can see there's no real gap there, and it's on the material. So now I'm putting my heart bead on. If it's a directional bead, make sure you're putting it in the right direction. And then I am pulling it as close and as taut as I can. And then I'm going to insert my needle right next to that bead with that hole, that exit hole, lined right up with that drawn line. I'm going to go down. I'm going to flip it back over, insert that needle in that hole there. And I know it's going to come right up where I need it to. If you feel any knot at any point in this process, stop and untie that knot, because it will keep, if that knot ever comes undone, then your strand of sewing there, I guess it's embroidery, will not be as secure. So there we have it. So when it's a flat bead, it sits so much more nicely. This process is much more smooth and flush, as you can see here, versus those ones that are not the same height. It's a lot harder to get it to look as nice there as it is as you're doing these letters, but it's not impossible. It's just a little bit more difficult. I'm going to put on my next letter. I'm holding it nice and taut, pressing it down, making sure my thread is entangled, and pushing it through. And then back up through those beads. It's important that you're inserting your needle as close to that hole right there as you can when you're going back down, and then you want to kind of back stitch through that bead so that everything stays nice and tight and nothing is going to kind of fall loose or anything. So one of the nice things about this process is that if you don't like how you just sewed something on, you can just pull it right back out. And the same goes for the one before that. Okay, you just loosen it slightly, and then you can just pull the threads out and redo all your work. Not that you want to redo your work, but you can fix it, which is really nice. So I'm going to go through and put those other letters on that I have picked out right now, and then I'll show you just the progression. So as you can see, I have these sewn on. Everything's nice and tight up against this material. But I can still remove it one by one if I make a mistake. If I run out of thread, all I have to do is pull this one to the back, and then start just like I did with this one here, with poking up through the bottom, and then knot those two together, continue on, and then knot my starting thread with my finishing thread there. Really the only thing you have to worry about in this process is just making sure that you are backstitching every single time so that you keep everything nice and clean and smooth. There's no major knots or anything unless you mess up a bead like I did, but make sure that you are really securing these knots here, your starting and finishing threads, so that things don't, so that at least the first and last bead don't unravel. But other than that, like I said, it's a pretty simple process. It isn't overly hard, it's just time consuming. And obviously, if you're using it on a panel of a bag that has been stabilized, you will need this guy right here eventually, because your fingers will become raw. Ask me how I know. Unfortunately, for this video, I'm not going to have this all finished for you to see. I'm sure I will share it on Instagram or somewhere at some point. But I admittedly don't like the beads that I purchased to go in between the pink beads here that match so nicely. They're too large, so I need to find something else there. But anyway, I hope you liked it. I hope it was what you wanted when you requested this for those who did request it. And if not, then maybe you just got a chance to look at some pretty beadwork. So thanks for tuning in.